She found a moss-covered mine cart deep in the forest. The rails disappeared into the darkness underground. She decided to follow them and saw what the town had kept secret her whole life. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The forest behind Loretta Marshall's house had always been the sort of place people pointed to with a half-serious warning, the kind that sits between folklore and memory. It was dense, older than the town itself, a tangle of ancient pines and firs that rose straight into the gray northern sky. When she was a girl, the white children in her neighborhood used to whisper about the deep places where old mines had collapsed and shadows seemed to breathe. Back then, she pretended she didn't care, but she did. Even now, at 72, she could recall the shiver that ran through her whenever someone mentioned the rickety tracks left behind by miners who had worked the hills generations earlier. Her parents had always warned her never to wander too far, and she had obeyed that rule longer than they lived. For decades, she kept to the trail that looped politely behind her property and led back home again. She had never had a reason to go deeper. But grief changed the relationship a person had with silence. Since her husband Joseph passed 6 months earlier, the house felt too quiet, the air too still, and even the creaking porch boards sounded like something was missing. She kept hearing his voice in memory, the way he used to murmur thoughts half to himself, half to her, the last of which had come only a week before he died, when he had squeezed her hand weakly and whispered, "If you ever find the old rails, follow them. That's where the truth lies. The truth our family was denied." At the time, she thought the medication had confused him. Now she wasn't so sure. On the morning everything began, her neighbor, a young mother named Eliza, knocked on the front door in a panic. Her small terrier, Milo, had slipped his collar and dashed into the woods before she could catch him. Loretta hadn't planned to leave the house that day, but something in her neighbor's voice, tight with worry, trembling on the edge of tears, pulled her outside. She grabbed her coat, her old walking stick, and agreed to help. It felt strange to step into the forest with purpose rather than out of habit. Stranger still was the way the air shifted once she passed the familiar tree line and entered deeper cover. It seemed colder under the bowed canopy of branches, the sunlight broken into thin silver lines that barely reached the forest floor. Every sound, the distant rustle of the wind, the creak of tree trunks, echoed as though magnified by distance. She walked farther than she intended, calling Milo's name every few minutes. Her breath puffed in small clouds in the chill air. Each step took her across damp needles and thick moss, the forest muffling her footsteps until she felt like she was trespassing into some untouched world. It was only when her walking stick struck something solid beneath a thick carpet of green that she stopped. The sound was not the soft thud of wood hitting soil, but a sharp metallic tap. Frowning, she knelt slowly, cautiously, and brushed aside the moss. Thin, rust-coated metal glinted under her fingertips. A rail, a narrow gauge track, the kind that hadn't been used in almost a century. She ran her hand along it, feeling the uneven surface beneath the growth. Under the moss, the metal was unexpectedly clean, as if the greenery had been scraped away recently. She paused. That wasn't possible. Nothing should be touching rails this old. No machines ran through these woods anymore. No hikers wandered this deep. And yet someone, at some point not long ago, had brushed aside the moss. She followed the rail slowly, pulse thudding with a mix of curiosity and unease. The tracks curved around the trunk of an enormous fir and then descended into a shallow dip in the landscape. She pushed aside a drooping branch and found herself stepping into a clearing she had never seen before. The forest formed a dome overhead, knitting together so tightly that the light dimmed into greenish twilight. And in the center of the clearing stood a cart. Not just any cart, but an old mining cart. the sort she had only ever seen in museums or in brittle, sepia-colored photographs. It stood tilted on the track, half swallowed by the earth, its wheels rusted, its metal sides layered with lush, bright moss. It looked as though the forest had been trying to reclaim it for decades. But just like the rail, parts of it had been disturbed. On the right side, where the handle curved upward, the moss had been brushed away, revealing fresh, reddish metal beneath the green. Someone had touched it. Someone had held it. Loretta approached the cart with a caution that bordered on reverence. The air around it felt stiller, as if the clearing were holding its breath. Peering inside, she saw remnants of another life. An old miner's vest, stiff with time, a metal cup dented on one side, a broken lantern handle, and several small stones with glittering flecks embedded in them. She picked one up, feeling the grainy texture beneath her thumb, and set it back down carefully, as if afraid the past might crumble at her touch. The cart was positioned directly in front of a mound of fallen branches, dried needles, and earth. Something about the shape of that mound made her uneasy. It wasn't natural. It looked like a deliberate covering, like something had been hidden. Her breath tightened when she noticed faint footprints beside it. Small. Narrow. Not child-sized, but small enough to belong to a petite adult. The edges of the prints were crisp, not weathered. She swallowed hard. With trembling hands, she pushed aside the branches. Beneath them yawned a black void, a tunnel entrance, a collapsed but not sealed shaft. Stale air breathed out from the darkness, carrying with it the cold, damp scent of deep earth. The kind of smell mines held when they had been closed for years, but not abandoned entirely. She felt a shiver coil up her spine. Against her better judgment, she leaned closer, lifting the broken lantern handle she had found in the cart. Her heart pounded as she peered into the darkness. She thought of Joseph again, his hand holding hers, his fading voice urging her to find the truth where the rails disappeared. She had dismissed it then. Now she wondered whether he had been trying to tell her something he never managed to explain. Taking a slow, steadying breath, she stepped inside the mouth of the tunnel. The light behind her dimmed instantly, replaced by the suffocating black ahead. Her eyes took long seconds to adjust. She pressed one hand to the wall to keep her balance. The rock was cold and damp beneath her fingers. The silence inside was absolute. So complete she could hear her own heartbeat. She walked deeper, one careful step at a time. Thin beams of decayed wood crisscrossed the ceiling, sagging under the weight of time. Old tools lay abandoned along the walkway, scraps of fabric, fragments of rope, and something else. Fresh mud smeared across a stone. Someone had touched that stone recently. Her mind raced with possibilities she didn't want to consider. The tunnel opened gradually into a larger chamber, where a hole in the ceiling let down a single shaft of muted daylight. Dust particles floated through it like drifting stars. And there, wedged between two fallen support beams, she saw a shape that didn't belong to the age and decay of the room. A box. A heavy metal box. A lock on the front of it shone faintly. Newer, less worn, recently scratched. She approached slowly, feeling the weight of the chamber press around her. With effort, she tugged the box free. It shifted reluctantly, as if fighting to remain hidden. The sound of metal scraping against wood echoed through the cavern. When the box finally came loose, she nearly stumbled under its weight. Holding her breath, she opened it. Her heart stopped. Inside were old letters, tied in bundles, yellowed envelopes addressed to people she knew, or their parents, or grandparents. Letters stamped decades earlier, but never delivered. Beneath them lay papers that looked like legal documents, and underneath those, nestled carefully, were pieces of jewelry, coins, and gemstones, that gleamed even in the dim shaft of light. But it was one envelope in particular that made her knees weaken. Her family's name written across the front in her father's handwriting. She whispered, "Dear God." Before she could pull the letter out, a loud crack echoed from the tunnel she had just walked through. A rock tumbled, striking the chamber floor. Her pulse spiked. She wasn't alone in the mine. Someone else was here. Someone who had been here recently. Someone who might be coming back right now. She clutched the box against her chest, heart hammering painfully, and stared into the dark of the tunnel. The sound that followed, a slow, deliberate crunch of gravel beneath a boot, told her everything she needed to know. She inhaled sharply. Someone was inside the mine with her, and they were getting closer. The forest did not loosen its grip on her the next morning. If anything, it seemed to tighten it, as though the trees themselves had spent the night thinking about her, considering her presence, and deciding she was not yet finished with them. When Naomi stepped out of her small cabin just after dawn, the air was cool enough to sting her cheeks, and the scent of damp moss and pine needles wrapped around her like a heavy cloak. The memory of the abandoned minecart was still bright in her mind, vivid enough that she almost wondered whether it had been a dream. But the ache in her legs, the mud dried on her boots, and the scraped palm she had earned while scrambling down a rocky slope were all too real. She hadn't imagined it. Something ancient and left behind had been waiting for her in the forest, and she had stumbled into its silence with the unprepared innocence of someone who had spent years refusing to listen to her own instincts. That morning, however, she felt no fear. Only a curious, restless pull, like the forest was calling her by a name she hadn't used in years. She made herself a cup of strong coffee, though she barely tasted it, pacing the narrow porch with the mug warming her hands. Her thoughts kept circling back to what she had seen: the moss-covered cart, the glint of rails beneath layers of time, the mouth of the tunnel almost swallowed by earth. The image contrasted sharply with the peaceful view of the forest waking around her now. The sunlight filtered in long, thin beams through the canopy, catching droplets of moisture still clinging to the leaves. Birds darted between branches, their wings whispering in short bursts. It was a morning like any other, and yet Naomi felt the weight of something waiting beneath the calm, a quiet pressure at her back, nudging her toward the part of the forest she had never dared to venture into before yesterday. She finished the coffee, set the cup aside, and went back inside for her notebook. It had become a habit over the past year to write before she lost her nerve, to gather any scattered thoughts and turn them into something solid. But when she opened the blank page, her pen hovered uselessly above it. The only thing she could think of writing about was the minecart and the tunnel. Nothing else felt worth putting into words. And yet, she didn't want to cheapen the experience by reducing it to a rushed paragraph. Some things needed to be lived twice before they could be written once. So she closed the notebook and set it aside. Not today, she thought. Today was for understanding what she had found. Tomorrow, maybe words would come. She gathered her backpack, adding a flashlight, 2 spare batteries, a small first aid kit, and a bottle of water. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she slipped in the folded letter she had found tucked into the attic of her cabin when she first moved in. She had discovered it by accident, wedged behind a beam, forgotten by whoever had lived there before. It contained only one sentence, written in a hurried hand. "The forest keeps what the town forgets." Naomi didn't know why she brought it now. She only felt that it belonged to the silence she might find again in the mine. The walk to the abandoned cart took longer than it had the day before. The forest had a way of shifting its paths, making familiar turns unfamiliar, as though testing whether she truly intended to return. Branches that had seemed harmless now reached for her clothes, catching her sleeves and brushing her hair like thin fingers. Somewhere far off, she heard the low hum of wind weaving through the treetops. But in the deeper sections of the forest, even wind grew quiet. Step by step, the world softened into a hushed stillness until Naomi could hear her own heartbeat more clearly than the sound of her boots on the mossy ground. She reached the clearing almost without realizing it. One moment she was weaving between trees, and the next she stepped into a circle of open light where the cart rested exactly as she had left it, as though it had been waiting for her with an ancient patience. The sight of it sent a ripple down her spine. The moss covering it seemed thicker today, curling along the rusted metal as if trying to reclaim it entirely. She approached slowly, scanning the ground around the rails, noticing details she had overlooked yesterday. The faint imprint of old boot tracks hardened into the earth, the remains of a broken lantern half buried under leaves, a cluster of stones arranged in a pattern she couldn't immediately make sense of. The cart itself looked even older in the morning light. She ran her fingers along the rim, feeling the cold roughness of the rust, the grit of time layered thick beneath her touch. How long had it been sitting here? Decades? A century? No one in town had ever mentioned a mine in the forest, but that wasn't surprising. The town had a long history of forgetting things, especially things that made people uncomfortable. Naomi knew that better than most. Her grandmother had often spoken in riddles about letters that had been lost, voices that had been silenced, stories that had vanished because people stopped telling them. Only later in life had Naomi realized those stories had not vanished. They had simply been buried. She took a deep breath and gripped the edge of the cart. It didn't move. But after a moment's hesitation, she applied more pressure, pushing it along the rails. To her surprise, the wheels groaned and resisted for a second, then shifted, sending a sharp metallic echo through the silent clearing. She froze. The sound echoed again from deeper within the tunnel, like something metal stirring in response. Naomi waited, her breath held tight, her ears straining for any sign of movement. But nothing came. The forest returned to its stillness. The moment passed. She pushed again, and the cart rolled a few inches before stopping. The rails disappeared into the throat of the tunnel, swallowed by darkness. Naomi stepped closer to the entrance. The air inside was colder, carrying a faint scent of minerals and earth. Her flashlight beam cut through the black, illuminating rough walls, fallen beams, and far-off shadows that twitched as if alive. She felt the tremor of old fear rising, but she refused to turn back. Whatever had been stored here in the past, whatever letters, documents, or treasures had been hidden, was part of her town's forgotten truth. And if the town had no interest in remembering, then she would. She stepped into the tunnel. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, soft in some places, and dangerously slick in others. Water dripped rhythmically from the ceiling, forming small puddles that reflected the beam of her flashlight. As she moved deeper, the light behind her faded until she was completely enveloped in the mine's breath. The silence was so thick, it seemed to carry its own weight. Each sound she made, the scrape of her boot on stone, the rustle of her coat, echoed down the tunnel like a warning. But she pushed forward. After several minutes, she reached the first branching corridor. According to the plan she remembered forming in her mind the night before, this was where the miners had separated the tunnels into primary and secondary routes. The left tunnel sloped sharply downward, while the right remained level, leading into what looked like a small chamber supported by wooden beams. Naomi chose the chamber first. She stepped inside, sweeping her light across the walls. And then she froze. Letters. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, tucked carefully into the cracks of the stone walls, sealed in glass jars, bundled together with faded twine. Some envelopes had yellowed so much they were nearly brown, while others were surprisingly intact. Her breath caught in her throat. She approached slowly, reaching out to touch one of the bundles. The envelope on top was addressed to a woman she recognized, a teacher who had vanished from the town's records more than 70 years ago. The letter was dated during the period when the town had been embroiled in political turmoil, a time when certain families, including hers, had been pushed aside, marginalized, their voices dismissed. Naomi felt her pulse hammering. These letters were pieces of history that had never surfaced. They were the missing pieces of countless stories, the answers to questions the town had long pretended didn't exist. She took down one of the jars and held it close, wiping away dust with her sleeve. Inside was a folded letter with a broken seal. She felt the weight of the moment, heavy and electric. She thought of her grandmother, of her stories, of the quiet sadness in her voice whenever she spoke about that era. The forest keeps what the town forgets. Naomi turned toward the deeper tunnel. The air there was colder, almost sharp, and yet she felt a pull stronger than fear. She stepped out of the chamber and followed the sound of her own breathing into the darkness. But after only a few steps, she stopped again. There were footprints, fresh ones. They led deeper into the mine, their edges crisp, untouched by time or water. Someone else had been here recently. Maybe someone was here now. Naomi felt a shiver run down her spine, but instead of retreating, she tightened her grip on the flashlight and followed the footprints deeper into the darkness, into a story that had been unfinished for too long. She did not look back. Naomi followed the footprints with the kind of caution she had not used since childhood, when her grandmother would send her to fetch firewood from behind the old shed and warn her to watch for loose slats and snakes curled in the shadows. The mine seemed to breathe around her, each step carrying her deeper into a silence so dense it pressed against her like a second skin. Her flashlight beam traveled across the walls, catching flecks of mineral and glimmers of moisture that made the stone shimmer faintly. The footprints, whoever they belonged to, were spaced evenly, careful and deliberate, as if the person who made them knew the mine's habits, knew exactly where the ground was weak and where the beams sagged under the weight of time. Naomi kept her distance from the prints, stepping beside them instead of on them, as if erasing them would break the fragile thread connecting her to whoever had been here before. The further she went, the clearer the scent of the tunnel became. A mix of cold mineral, damp wood, and something faintly metallic that reminded her of old tools left too long in rain. The corridor narrowed, the ceiling lowering enough that she had to bend in places. Her light flickered once and steadied, reminding her that she had brought extra batteries. But the thought of losing light, even for a moment, made her heart leap. Still, she walked on, more driven by instinct and the weight of discovery than by fear. The footprints led her to a place where the tunnel curved sharply. Here, the air grew colder. She paused and touched the wall. Moisture beaded on her fingertips. Somewhere ahead, water was dripping steadily, echoing in the hollow space, and giving the impression of movement just out of sight. She lifted the flashlight and swept the beam forward. The passage opened into a much larger chamber, deeper and more intact than the one where she had found the letters. Heavy wooden beams framed the ceiling, reinforced with metal braces that looked more recent than the rusted rails she had seen outside. Someone had been trying to keep this place from collapsing. Naomi stepped inside, and the size of the chamber took her breath. The ceiling rose high above her, disappearing into darkness. Rusted machinery winches, pulleys, conveyors sat abandoned in rows like silent giants. Old ropes hung from metal brackets, stiff and frayed, swaying slightly, though no wind reached this deep. Crates were stacked along the walls, some split open, spilling stones and dust onto the ground. But the footprints led not to the crates, nor to the machinery, but to a narrow alcove at the far end of the chamber, half hidden behind a leaning metal cart that had toppled long ago. Naomi followed the line of prints, stepping carefully around loose rock. When she reached the alcove, she crouched and shone her light into the shadows. At first, she saw only broken boards and a collapsed support beam, but then her beam caught something reflective, a sliver of metal, polished enough that the light bounced directly back. She leaned closer and saw that it was a latch. Her pulse quickened. The latch was attached to a wooden chest wedged beneath the fallen beam. Most of the chest was buried in rubble, but enough remained visible to show that it had once been reinforced with iron bands, though now they were rust-pitted and half-broken. She set her backpack down and cleared away debris, careful not to disturb the structure around her. Each movement sent small puffs of dust spiraling into the air, illuminated by her light like tiny drifting ghosts. Slowly, the top of the chest emerged, revealing carved initials on its lid. The letters were faint, worn by water and time, but she could make out the shape of them. A. M. She froze. She knew those initials. The town had a long-forgotten mayor from the late 1800s, a man named Abram Monroe, whose family had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Her grandmother had mentioned his name only once, in a story she refused to finish. Naomi remembered the expression that crossed her grandmother's face, a strange mix of anger and sorrow. Naomi brushed her thumb across the initials. The wood felt fragile, but the latch remained intact. She pulled gently. It resisted at first, then gave way with a sighing creak. The lid lifted. Inside, neatly arranged and astonishingly well-preserved, were stacks of letters tied with ribbon, bundles of documents sealed with cracked wax, and several small velvet pouches filled with stones that glittered faintly under the flashlight beam. The sight of the letters filled her throat with a lump she couldn't swallow. She lifted one of the bundles. The top envelope bore a date from more than a century ago, the handwriting elegant, looping. The addressee was a name she recognized from a street in town that had long since been renamed. She opened another velvet pouch and let a few stones spill into her palm. They were rough-cut gems, emeralds, sapphires, amethysts, each catching the light with small bursts of color. She had never held anything like them. They were heavier than she expected, warmer too, as if carrying their own memories. These weren't just valuables. These were part of a story the town had tried to bury. Letters from citizens who had disappeared from records. Stones that had vanished from the town vault the same year several families were driven out. The past was clustering around her, shaping itself into a truth too heavy to ignore. Footsteps echoed behind her. Naomi spun, flashlight raised. The beam jittered across the chamber, leaping over crates and shadows, catching nothing. Her breath tightened. The footsteps came again, soft but unmistakable, moving along the far wall. "Who's there?" she called, her voice cracking. Silence answered her. She waited, every muscle locked in place. The silence stretched. Then a faint scraping sound brushed against the stone, as if someone were dragging something lightly across the floor. Naomi closed the chest, her fingers trembling. She didn't know whether the sound belonged to a person or simply the shifting of old beams. But she wasn't alone. Not in her mind, and not in this mine. She stepped back from the alcove and scanned the chamber again. Her light caught movement, a shadow slipping behind a support beam. Her heart leapt. She steadied her hand and directed the beam toward the place where the shadow had been. Nothing remained there now. She took a slow step forward. A whisper of cold air brushed past her cheek. She turned. The footprints. They were cleaner now, fresher, leading toward a narrow tunnel she hadn't noticed on her way in. The entrance to this tunnel was half hidden behind a collapsed conveyor belt. It sloped downward sharply and carried with it a deep chill that made her skin prickle. Something in her told her she needed to follow. Not out of recklessness, but because whoever was down here, whoever had been tending the mine, keeping the beams reinforced, leaving footprints, had left a piece of the story unfinished. She followed the footprints into the narrow tunnel. The walls closed around her, rough stone brushing her shoulders. Her flashlight beam shook despite her attempt to steady it. The tunnel descended further than she expected. In places, wooden planks had been laid to form a makeshift walkway where the ground had become too uneven. Naomi stepped lightly, testing each plank before putting her weight on it. Halfway down, she found something that made her stop. A lantern, still warm, its flame recently extinguished. The wick glowed faintly red. Someone had set it here minutes ago. Her breath caught. A soft thump echoed somewhere below, like a boot softly hitting earth. She swallowed, her throat dry. She called out again. "Is someone there?" But her voice sounded small, swallowed by the descending dark. She walked on. At the bottom of the slope, the tunnel opened into a surprisingly large cavern. Here, the air was colder than any other part of the mine. So cold, her breath fogged in front of her. The walls sparkled with mineral deposits, silver veins catching her light like frozen lightning. But what seized her attention first wasn't the stone. It was the wooden table set in the center of the cavern. A table, down here. On it lay a collection of items that made her heart twist with recognition. More documents, maps of the town drawn by hand, diaries, necklaces, rings, old keys. And on one corner of the table sat a wooden box overflowing with letters identical to the ones she had found in the alcove. Someone had been gathering them, preserving them, arranging them with care. Naomi stepped closer and lifted one of the maps. It showed the town as it had been nearly a century ago, with sections circled in red. Margins scrawled with notes. Evictions, disappearances, lost claims, seized property. Her flashlight beam trembled on the page. The mine was a vault, not for wealth, but for truth. She set the map down carefully. Then she noticed something else. On the far side of the cavern, near the wall, sat a chair. On the chair hung a coat, a dark wool coat worn thin at the elbows. Beneath it, on the ground, lay a pair of boots. She approached slowly. The boots were warm. Someone had been sitting here moments before she arrived. Naomi turned sharply, expecting to see someone behind her. Again, nothing. But the cavern no longer felt empty. She could sense a presence woven into the air, something neither threatening nor welcoming, but deeply aware of her. She reached for her flashlight again, but her hand brushed something else. A journal. It lay half hidden behind a stack of letters. The leather cover was cracked. She opened it. The first page made her inhale sharply. This mine keeps what the town is afraid to remember. I promised my family I would guard these histories until someone came for them. If you are reading this, you are the one meant to finish what I could not. No name. No date. But at the bottom, in faint pencil, a message. I heard footsteps today. I think she's close. Naomi closed the journal with trembling hands. The air felt suddenly warmer, as if someone had breathed beside her. She looked toward the tunnel she had come from. It felt much farther now, much darker. She whispered into the silence, "I'm here, I'll finish it." And the cavern seemed to hold its breath in response. She gathered several letters, the journal, and a handful of documents, and placed them gently into her backpack. Every instinct told her that taking anything from this place was a violation. But another instinct, stronger, told her this was why she had been led here. Not to leave the truth buried, but to carry it back to the surface, to the light. to the town that had spent generations refusing to see itself clearly. As she zipped her pack, the sound echoed strangely, almost like an answer. Naomi turned and began the climb back up the tunnel, one hand gripping the wall, the other holding the flashlight steady. The footprints she had followed earlier seemed to shift in the dim light, as if new ones appeared beside them for the briefest moment. So faint, she wasn't sure they were real. She didn't quicken her pace, but she didn't slow either. When she finally emerged into the chamber with the machinery, the stillness returned, deep, ancient. The alcove where she had found the chest felt like a distant memory. But the moment she stepped back into the first corridor, the one that led to the letters tucked into the walls, she felt a soft draft of warm air brush her cheek, like a hand passing close, but not touching. The walls seemed to pulse faintly, alive with the weight of the stories they held. By the time Naomi reached the tunnel entrance, daylight filtered through the opening in small, slanted beams. The forest's scent swept into the mine, the earthy, bright smell of moss and pine and living things. She paused, standing between darkness and light, feeling the weight of her pack. Behind her, the mine settled with a soft groaning sound, like a tired sigh. Naomi stepped out into the forest. The sunlight fell across her face, warm despite the chill in the air. The trees seemed taller than before, their branches heavy with the kind of silence that follows a long-awaited answer. The forest was no longer simply a place. It was a witness, a keeper, a guardian of truths that had outlived the people who wrote them. Naomi took a deep breath and began the walk home, each step heavy with purpose. She did not know yet how she would reveal what she had found, or whom she could trust. But she knew the town could no longer pretend. The story buried underground was rising, and she was the one carrying it. As she walked, the forest whispered behind her, a long, low murmur, like the rustle of hundreds of pages turning at once. And Naomi did not look back. The forest felt different when Naomi walked through it the next morning, as if it had shifted in the night, adjusting itself around the knowledge she now carried. The path that had once seemed tangled and confusing now appeared more open, as though the trees themselves stepped aside to let her pass. The air was crisp and unusually clear, with a faint sweetness lingering in the cold morning breeze. Naomi's steps were steady, her backpack heavy with the documents she had taken from the cavern. She had barely slept. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the glimmer of gemstones on the wooden table, the faded ink on century-old letters, the scrawled journal entries left by someone who had dedicated their life to guarding the truth. And she heard, over and over, the soft echo of her own whispered promise. "I'll finish it." Sunlight slipped through the trees in narrow beams, illuminating patches of moss and fallen leaves. The forest had always been quiet, but today the silence carried a sense of anticipation, as if it were waiting to see what she would do. Every sound, the crackle of twigs under her boots, the distant call of a bird, seemed louder, sharper. She felt watched, not with menace, but with a solemn kind of encouragement, like a hand on her back urging her forward. She was no longer wandering. She was walking toward something. As she neared the edge of the forest, the first houses of the town came into view, their morning lights blinking awake one window at a time. The sight of them stirred something deep in her chest, a mixture of anger and sorrow. This town, with its quiet streets and smiling faces, had been built on stories it refused to acknowledge. Families had been erased from records, truths buried under decades of silence, decisions made behind closed doors to shape a history that favored a few at the expense of many. Naomi could feel the documents in her pack shifting with every step, the weight of them pressing against her spine, reminding her that she now held the proof those missing voices had never been able to deliver. She reached her cabin and set the pack on her table, her hands trembling slightly. The room felt too small to contain what she had brought back. The sunlight streaming through the window fell across the surface of the table, catching the edges of the paper she had already removed and arranged. Letters neatly tied with string, maps covered in careful annotations, journals filled with accounts that told a story utterly different from the one the town had been telling for over a century. She organized them into piles, sorting them by date, trying to form a coherent timeline. The deeper she read, the clearer the picture became. Land seizures disguised as legal orders, forced evictions buried under bureaucratic language, desperate pleas from families whose voices had vanished in the years that followed. And beneath it all, a single thread of determination from someone who had chosen to hide these truths in the mine rather than let them be destroyed. Naomi ran her fingers over one journal entry that read, "They will come for these documents as they came for the people. But the forest is wiser than they know. It keeps what is true." She felt the words settle into her like a seed taking root. She had to bring these truths to the surface, carefully, deliberately, but boldly. As she sat reading, a sudden knock on her door jolted her upright. She hesitated, startled by how quickly fear crept into her chest. She gathered a few pages and slid them under her arm before opening the door. It was Mrs. Carver, one of the town's longtime residents, a woman known for her meticulous garden and her tendency to know everything happening within several blocks. Her face bore an expression Naomi had never seen on her. Confusion mixed with worry. "Naomi," she began, adjusting her shawl as if unsure whether she should speak. "The sheriff was asking around town earlier. He said someone reported seeing lights in the old forest mines. I thought you should know." Naomi felt a chill run through her. She thanked Mrs. Carver and watched her walk away, each step nervously quick. Once she closed the door, she leaned against it, taking a steadying breath. She knew what this meant. Someone had been watching the mine. Someone who didn't want those letters found. For a moment, doubt crept in. She wasn't trained for this. She wasn't an investigator or historian or public speaker. She was just one woman living in a tiny cabin at the edge of the forest. But the memory of the cavern, the table covered in letters, the journal waiting for her, as if knowing she would come, rose inside her like a steady flame. The truth wasn't safe in the mine anymore. It was safer with her, even if it meant being seen. She spent the next several hours preparing, making copies of the most important documents, scanning pages into her old computer, hiding originals in different places around her cabin. She arranged everything she needed into a thick folder. Then she took a deep breath and left the cabin, folder tucked securely under her arm. The walk to the town hall was harder than she expected, each step heavy with the weight of what she was about to do. People milled about the square shopkeepers opening their doors, children running across the pavement, an older man sweeping fallen leaves from the steps of the bakery. Life moved on oblivious to the century of forgotten injustice beneath it. Naomi walked straight toward the mayor's office. When she stepped inside, Mayor Ellery looked up from his desk, surprise flickering across his face. He was a broad-shouldered man with silver hair and the confident posture of someone used to having his words accepted without question. Naomi approached his desk, feeling the tremor in her hands. "I found something," she said, her voice steady despite her heartbeat. "Something that belongs to this town." She laid the folder on his desk and opened it. The mayor's eyes narrowed as he skimmed the first pages. His jaw tightened. He flipped through more pages, then looked up sharply. "Where did you get these?" Naomi met his gaze. "In the forest, in the old mine." Silence settled between them, tense and heavy. The mayor exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. "These should not exist," he said quietly. "But they do," Naomi said. And they always did. The town just didn't want to see them. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, a deep crease forming between his brows. Naomi, you don't understand the trouble this could cause. These letters paint a picture that will upend everything people believe about our history. Maybe that's the point, Naomi said softly. Maybe the truth deserves to be seen, even if it's painful. The mayor studied her in silence, as though weighing the truth in her words. The room felt suddenly airless. Then he closed the folder and slid it back toward her. Leave them with me, he said. I'll review them. Naomi shook her head. No, they're safer with me. His gaze sharpened. These documents are dangerous. I know, she answered, but not because they're lies. The mayor's expression shifted. Something flickered there, a flicker of fear, or perhaps recognition. He stood slowly, walked to the window, and looked out at the town square. This town was built on many things, he said. Some honest, some not. And now it can be rebuilt on truth, Naomi replied. He didn't answer. For a long moment, he simply stared out the window. Naomi sensed that some part of him knew she would not be deterred. She picked up the folder and left his office before he could say anything more. The sky had darkened by the time she stepped outside, clouds gathering over the forest. A storm was coming. She walked home quickly, the wind tugging at her coat, the first drops of rain beginning to fall. When she reached the cabin, she paused on the porch, looking back toward the forest. The trees swayed in the rising wind, their branches bending as though urging her inside. She entered the cabin and placed the folder on her table. Lightning flashed, illuminating the room in sharp white. Thunder followed, rumbling deep and loud. Naomi lit a lantern, setting it beside the stack of documents. The flame burned steady, casting warm light across the pages. She sat at the table and opened her notebook, the same one she had closed the morning before, unable to write a word. Now the words came easily. She wrote everything. The minecart covered in moss, the tunnel breathing in the dark, the letters tucked into stone cracks, the footprints leading her deeper, the cavern filled with truth, the journal waiting for her. She wrote until her wrist ached, and the storm raged against the windows. She wrote until the truth was no longer just something she carried. It became part of her. When she finally set her pen down, the storm began to ease. Rain softened into a steady drizzle, and the trees swayed with a quieter rhythm. Naomi stood and stepped outside. The forest glowed faintly under the storm's fading light, the leaves shimmering as if washed clean. She walked to the edge of the trees, stopping where the earth grew soft, and moss spread thick beneath her boots. The forest exhaled around her, an old, deep breath, warm against her cheek. She whispered into the night. I finished it. The forest answered with a rustling of branches, gentle and steady, like the turning of pages in a book that had been closed for far too long. Naomi looked toward the darkness of the forest, then toward the lights of the town below. For the first time since moving there, she felt the two were no longer separate. The mine had bridged them, the truth had bound them, and she, standing between them, felt like part of something vast, woven into a history that could no longer be hidden. She returned to the cabin, left the lantern burning, and opened the window, letting the cool night air drift inside. Behind her, the forest kept its silent vigil, and Naomi, with the weight of the town's forgotten truth now fully in her hands, finally felt at peace. Subscribe to the channel, watch the next videos, and share this one with others.